see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
I think rambling and dialogue is a great way to go about this, because the topic we're talking about, the issue, it's not a program, it's not like a prescribed thing you have to do. And you'll hear, and I'll say this in different ways, but it's really a consciousness,
Yeah.
awareness and intention, and everything moves from that. So I think it's a good way to talk about it.
Yeah, so just kind of talking about empathy in kind of a free form, kind of exploratory, almost an improv kind of a way is good to do. It's kind of doing the nature of empathy in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. And there's, with nature, I always think of there's inner nature and there's outer nature, and we want to interface the two. So, a lot of it, particularly, I don't know, are we starting? I mean,
we're going. This is it.
Okay. What I was going to say is when I'm working like in a school, and most of my work is in schools, and typically, a teacher might say, the kids aren't always nice to each other. They're mean. There's an issue of bullying, and we need to, get them to be aware of how they hurt people's feelings. But it's not something you can just like lay on the kids. It's a whole community there, and the adults really drive the bus, or should be driving the bus. And so it takes some inner nature, some self-reflection on our own emotional responses, because empathy is really about emotion, And then there's the outer nature. I think I once wrote that it's an outside-in dynamic. You look what's going on around you. You look at how I interface with that, or what feelings it brings up for me, and then I respond in kind.
Well, you've been looking at this. You're David A. Levine. And Levine, sorry.
That's okay.
I'm really bad at names. I always mangle everyone's name.
Well, it all depended on which uncle. One uncle said Levine, one said Levine. My great uncle said, or my great grandfather said Levine. So.
And you wrote the book, Teaching Empathy. I'm just bringing it up on the screen here. Yes. Teaching Empathy, a blueprint for caring, compassion, and community. And the publication date is 2005. So you've been working at this relatively a long time. I mean, empathy is just really starting to take off now. And, back in 2005 was kind of like the beginning of it.
Yes, well, it's actually that book that you've just shown is really, although it's the first one from Solution Tree, the publisher with that title, for me it was really a second generation book, because I was trying to get publishers to publish my vision and views on schools and children and teachers and administrators through the lens of empathy. And I don't know if you noticed in that book, Edwin, but I have music in there as well. I'm a musician. And there's a CD, and I was always trying to get publishers, and I'm talking like back in the late 80s, to buy into the idea that we could create emotional experiences for children using music as the catalyst for dialogue, and then have accompanying lessons. And I had some very powerful songs that I was using with kids in workshops, and everyone said pretty much, what a great idea, but we're not ready for it, or we don't publish that kind of thing. So I published it myself. I wrote a book in 1998 called Teaching Empathy. It was just a little booklet, and somehow a publisher found it, Solution Tree, and they said, we'd like to republish this. So it was another 3 years of development. So by the time it came out, it was something that I had literally been working on with children in schools since the late 80s.
Wow, that's quite a while then. That's very early into it, and so you're like one of the real pioneers, I would say, then around empathy in the schools and kind of articulating the vision.
Well, I think it's certainly like so many things. It's even, if anyone who's a teacher who might be watching this knows that our best lessons are often the ones that come to us in the moment. You might get up from the back of the room and walk to the front, and you get an idea or a vision, or even driving to school, you think, oh, I'm going to try this today. And that's kind of what happened with me with empathy. I was a teacher, an elementary school teacher, and also I was someone who was raised with music. My parents were musicians, traditional American music, and growing up, not only did I fall asleep many nights to the sound of them singing and playing, but I wanted to be a musician as well. And my first instrument that I pursued was the fiddle, not the violin. I wanted to be a fiddle player, you know. And so I was playing music, playing the fiddle, and I was meeting friends of my parents who were, you know, touring, musicians on the road. And everyone was always welcoming. You know, it wasn't about how good you were or how long you've been playing or what tunes you knew. It was that you played and we play, let's play together. So it was a multi-generational experience. It was invitational. And I felt like I was part of that community, and I felt a sense of bonding, connection. And so as I grew older and I was a musician, I realized that music was not so much something I wanted to do as a recording artist or a performer, but I wanted to use it as a catalyst for community building. And my focus, I was drawn to work with children. And, you know, if you want to work with children, you know where you're going to find them most days. You're going to find them in schools, you know. So I was teaching, and I wouldn't, you know, one time I always tell this story because it really illustrates the vision of music and how it brought me into this world of empathic dialogue with kids. I was about to do, I was a teacher, as I said, but eventually I started working on my own for the federal government Department of Education, doing alcohol and other drug prevention work. But I'd always walk in with my guitar. And you know, I don't know, Edwin, we could maybe free flow this. Maybe I'll either sing a cappella or recite the words to a song that really was the entry point for me in this world of empathy education.
That'd be great. I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, so I was about to do this song, and this girl walks in. She was an 8th grader, and she sees my guitar, and she looks at me, and she looks at my guitar, and then she says, "Excuse me, are you going to sing a song?" I said, "Yeah, I probably will." And she said, nothing personal, but are you going to do self-esteem, sing-along, feel-good songs? And I laughed, and she laughed, and you know what she was really saying was, "Are you going to do some contrived lesson about how we should be and how we should act?" And she said, "Because we're in 8th grade, and if you tell us what to do, we won't listen." So I actually did say, "What would you like me to do?" And she said, "Make it real. Talk with us. Don't talk at us. Help us explore the challenges that we face every day." I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but this was essentially it. And so I never forgot her words. You know, at the end of that lesson, she walked out and she gave me a thumbs up, you know, and we talked a little bit later. And that was probably about 1989. And ever since then, I've been in search of the most efficient and effective ways, because I don't always have a lot of time, the best ways to create what I call an emotionally safe learning environment. So young people and adults, you know, I work with adults as well, can explore in an authentic way the social challenges that they face. And empathy always is the thing we always come back to, which is, you know, a consciousness about we're in this moment with other people. And often what I think, often what I feel in these social situations, it's very similar to what they're feeling, what they're thinking. You might not realize it, but it's very, very true. And so if we can learn the skills, the social skills, you know, of speaking, listening, being non-judgmental, we can make connections, we can create understanding, and that's really what empathy is. That's what creates understanding, is empathy.
Well, the way I've kind of come to this is that we need to build a culture of empathy. So that we need to transform the whole social structure system so that they support connection between people. And you've really been focusing on that in the schools, and it sounds like you came to that through the arts. That the arts are a way of connecting people, and you were kind of aware of that and that sense of connection. And the empathy that happens, you know, through eons. You know, the communities have sat around the fire, telling stories, playing music, creating that sense of connection and belonging. So it seems like that was kind of like your entry into the importance of empathy. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
beautifully stated and elegantly stated, because, you know, first of all, you mentioned the idea of culture. You know, there are so many programs and so many wonderful curriculum materials that have been developed for schools, you know, and I've seen schools using these. I've worked in schools. I've tried to complement some of these programs, you know, but if it's not something that's felt by the school population or by the school community, It will be just a program. It won't be a way of being. And in a school, and I'm going to keep coming back to schools, Edwin, because that's really where I focus my energies. In a school, culture is the way we do things. It's stated, it's articulated. This is how we do things. And the rationale is provided. This is why we do things. It's this way. It's not coercive. It's not you better do this or you'll be in trouble. It's like, no, we need to have a social agreement of how we work together and how we're going to learn together. So that's a culture. Now, when you have a culture which is predictable and consistent, you now have, a climate which is how it feels. A lot of times people confuse the two. They think they're the same thing, actually, culture and climate, and they're not. Culture is the way we do things. Climate is how it feels based on the cultural norms. So back to your point, we are building culture. To me, it's a consciousness movement, being conscious of the impact our choices have, our words, our actions, and then you ground everything with ritual. You mentioned, like I have this image of sitting around a fire, a sacred fire. And to me, sacred is connection. Connection was another word you used, connection. So important to me, feeling connected. There's nothing more painful than feeling isolated, alone, or disconnected. And we are all about building community through ritual and through common language. So that is essentially what happened. I experienced it through music and the arts. The arts is another avenue to making connections. I mean, as a musician, there's nothing better than playing music with someone else and being in flow with them, to use that term. There's also nothing better in my world than playing the fiddle and having a group of dancers before me all moving together to the rhythm, to the beat. We're all in it together. And so, it's not empathy, education, empathy, culture building. It's multifaceted, but the end result is always a sense of connection, belonging, and community.
Yeah, for me, it's another way I've come at it as well. For the empathy has been through dance. So it's that sense of dance, that connection, and kind of the deep emotional interaction with others. Because in the dance floor, it's like the rules are expanded of how deeply and how we can connect with each other. It's just the same way with music and all the arts. So the arts are such an important part in learning empathy. And it seems to be one of the qualities that, or one of the features that gets cut in the education budget. Oh, we don't need arts, so that gets, so it's kind of like putting a damper on actually empathy building, seems to me.
Well, I want to riff on this idea of art for a moment, because I think it's an art form to have authentic conversations with people. It's an art form to be able to work with others effectively. One of the processes that I always integrate into my work with schools is dialogue. And in the words of Peter Senge, dialogue is collectively exploring an issue. It doesn't mean we're going to have a decision or an agreement. It means we're going to come to an understanding of where each of us is in this moment. And we can do this with teams within schools. We can do it with students within a classroom. But it's truly an art form. And so what I see with schools cutting, yes, it's unfortunate. They are cutting money, budget cuts for the arts. They're also cutting funding and budget line items for social and emotional learning as well. The old adage, what gets measured gets done. And right now in this country, we are, under the umbrella of what, Arne Duncan has termed the Common Core Learning Standards. I'm sure you've heard of that. And conceptually, the idea is that you could move from Arkansas to New York State and you'll be having the same academic experience because there's this common core, right? Well, in the common core, you can sort of maybe read between the lines and see certain pro-social skills that are necessary. But the essence of it is what gets measured gets done. And they're not measuring social skills, pro-social skills. The closest they come is to intervene when there's an antisocial behavior called bullying, I don't know. I think this whole idea of empathy becoming trendy. It really is trendy. I mean, I'm so pleased. I watched some of your other interviews, and I love how you begin each one with President Obama speaking about empathy. When I first heard President Obama use that word in his conversation, when he speaks of morals in such a way that binds people together, I can tell, I believe anyway, it's coming from his heart. He's not just, using some phrase that some speechwriter came up with him. I truly believe that his vision for the world is for people to come together. And he sees empathy as that binding force. I mentioned that before. In fact, I'll tell you a story about this, which I think is incredibly relevant. It really was meaningful to me. I live in New York State. I live about an hour and a half north of New York City in Ulster County. In fact, I live very close to Woodstock, New York. My first teaching job was at the Woodstock Elementary School. But I find myself going to the Bronx quite a bit, South Bronx, New York City, one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. And it was late January 2008. I believe President Obama had been inaugurated maybe 4 or 5 days previous. He was very new officially to the position of president. And I was listening to the radio, and they were playing, it was live coverage of the International Prayer Breakfast that's held every year in Washington. And President Obama was speaking. And he spoke of the way we need to live in this world. And he touched on many different religions, and, whether it was the Torah or the Bible, he went on and on and on all over the world. And he kept bringing it back. He said, it comes back to one thing. Love thy brother as thyself. He said, the golden rule. It really is the rule that we need to live by so that we can have world peace. And I was listening to him, and it was ironic. I'm driving over the George Washington Bridge, and he's saying this, and I'm thinking, a bridge to the Bronx right now with his words, right? So I walked into the school, and of course, anyone who works in the inner cities in this country, who was in a school right after Barack Obama was elected, knows that there was an electricity, that he's a rock star, and that his election symbolized hope and optimism and opportunity and dreams for so many of the minority children. I mean, I just felt that. You see it. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Still exists today. So I walked in that day. It was the third grade class, and I wrote on the board the golden rule. And I said, we're going to do a lesson today called the golden rule. And what is that word? What does that mean? And that was the whole lesson, right? It was all about, my mother teaches me that, I learned that in church, or, we talk about it in school, and Mr. Levine, you work with us on that, because I work with that school quite a bit. I have relationships with the students. And I said, I thought of this because of our President Obama. And as soon as I said that, all the smiles broke out, and I said, and President Obama believes in this stuff. I know he's brand new president, but I just heard him say this. And if we can practice this every day, school, our neighborhoods, our lives will be a better place. So I ended the lesson, and this little boy hadn't said much in the whole lesson. He was just sitting back there quietly. Little tiny guy raises his hand, and he goes, Mr. Levine, he goes, I wish this was a subject in school, the golden rule. And I thought, wouldn't that be great? And, and to quote Obama's speech, because I've read it since, he said, we need to live on this earth with dignity and respect for all, and I don't mean to just go on and on about this, but this to me is why we need to make empathy in education a movement. We need to push back to the people that say the standard for success is a test score in math or English or science, and comparing that to the rest of the world. We need certainly to have accountability in schools, but there's other forms of measurement about the success of the school experience. And empathy and its affiliated social skills and social awarenesses, that's really the essence of what we need to infuse into what we do in schools.
Yeah, I can see that this is very meaningful and important to you. It's a big part of your life. It seems to me what seems to be important to you, if I'm just seeing this, is just that sense of connection. Is that when people are alone, you have that sense of aloneness, and there's a sort of a pain involved in being alone and disconnected. And through empathy is a way that our hearts, our souls, or deeper parts of ourselves kind of connect, and that's very. It seems to be something that we need for just for well to be well functioning human beings.
If you think about what you've just said, which I completely agree with, the vision, the idea of soul, that we all have a soul purpose, and that there's not a grander, more passionate place to be standing than when you've been able to unearth what your soul purpose is, or to restate it, your gift to the world and what you're here to do. And really it's diversity education at its best, because we're all different. And one of the sad things that unfolds when someone feels disconnected is they let go of that passion if they think it will gain them acceptance into a group, or if they're afraid of being ostracized for something they want to do. And I have to tell you, I've been through this myself. I still go through it, because what I work with in schools, what I work with when I talk with teachers, kids, and decision makers like the superintendents or principals, it's not the typical kind of thing they talk about. It's so interesting. I saw David Brooks. David Brooks is he was doing a TED talk. I was watching a TED talk of his once, and he was talking about he's been in Washington for many years, and he has seen these senators, from both sides of the aisle, when they're not like, in the public eye, when they're like, back rooms or whatever in a restaurant. He said, you'd think they're like married to each other. They're so close. They're hugging, they're whispering in each other's ears. There's this intimacy. And then as soon as they come out into the spotlight of position, they're separate. And he said, you'd think there'd be a link between the way they really feel, not just about each other, but about people, because it's evident, and the decisions they make and the policies that they support and help to create, And the same thing holds true in schools. I talk with principals all the time. We're going to be running an event here in New York where I live. I live, as I said, in New York State at the foothills of the Catskills. And I've been bringing my work for the last 3 months to a place called the Ashokan Center, which is right near the Ashokan Reservoir. Beautiful, beautiful reservoir. And the Ashokan Center is 275 acres, and it's been known for years for outdoor education. And now we're expanding the work. They're building all these new sustainable buildings on the campus, etc. And I'm bringing my work on empathy there. And we're running a day in about 6 weeks, May 11th, 2012, where we're inviting, principals, superintendents, community members, teachers, students, etc., to come and spend a day talking about what's meaningful in education. And empathy is the focus of our conversation. And all I can say, Edwin, is that when I bring this up, I've been like talking to colleagues, it's assistant superintendents, all those folks. They all want to come. They all want to talk about it. They're all excited by it. They all say, this is what we went into teaching and education for. It's all about the kids, on and on and on. And yet, when they go back to their schools and their districts and they set up their budgets, they have to look and say, well, what will the State Department of Education, what will the Federal Department of Ed give us money for? And they're not giving them money for this stuff. You have to really fight for it. So we need to change this. And this is my passion. And we need to create a movement and make connections with people who agree, who not looking for people that agree, but say, why are we here? We're here, in schools, we're here for the well-being of the children and for their future, which is essentially the future of the world.
Well, that's what I see is to bring that into the schools, we need to be raising the level of empathy throughout society. Because it's going to be kind of reflected in the school policies and where the resources go. So it seems like the empathy really relates to so many different disciplines and areas of society. For example, we're talking about education here and the role of empathy in education, but there's also empathy within the legal system, the justice system, a restorative justice based, transitioning from this competitive gladiatorial kind of system that we have to more of restorative justice. And it kind of, if you start going through all the different, even in business, in corporations and in government, so it seems that this is really, for me at least, it's about creating a global culture of empathy and to raise the level, the dialogue about empathy, to raise the level of empathy throughout all of society. And all these different disciplines seem to overlap in a way that really empathy seems to be like the core of all these different disciplines. And I'm just kind of seeing how can we bring all these different communities together and work together to create this whole global culture of empathy. And the Ashoka, as you were mentioning, they're really focusing on the education and doing this great job of like bringing all these different organizations together around that, and you're part of that, as I understand, too.
Yes. Well, let me clarify something. First of all, Ashoka is, I guess they're a foundation, although not by, they're really innovators for public good. And they promote this vision of social entrepreneurship around the world. And one of the areas they focus upon are children, and schools are where you find children. That's Ashoka. They're right outside of Washington, D.C. And they are in the midst of a major empathy and education initiative. But it's funny, I should say, that where I live, there's also a place called Ashoken, and to Ashoka. And actually, I'm trying to get Ashoka at Ashoken for our Empathy Day. So they're not the same, but we both are looking at the same thing. And I am working with Ashoka as kind of an ad hoc member of their empathy team, But I want to go back to the point you made about cross disciplines, and I love the idea of global empathy. And to me, what hit me as you were talking, it really is about human relationships. That's really where everything moves from, whether it's in a school or a firehouse or a little league board of directors, of which I'm on, as well. The way I am with my children. I have an 11 and an 8-year-old, and it's all about the relationships that we intentionally cultivate. In the legal system, it's the same way. People have found that when you feel connected to another human being, even if you disagree with them, that you can still honor them. You still have the capacity to respect them. But you can't just snap your fingers and say, oh, we have a good relationship. It takes a great deal of focus, hard work, consciousness, and the ultimate empathy skill is high-level listening, to be non-judgmental, to try to pull in what people are saying and what they're representing and hold up a mirror, feed back to them what you sense they're thinking, what you sense they're feeling, and in some cases, what you sense they need, and find ways to provide that. That's what brings people together. And, there's probably thousands of stories throughout history where people were in a situation that was external, where maybe countries were at war, or there were other kinds of things happening between families or people in groups, whether it's a school board or whatever it might be. And when you can put the content and the agenda aside, and when you can bring in the humanity, that's when people make connections, and that's when you can resolve issues. And empathy is the way to do that.
So it's the seeing that the kind of the relationship between people is versus a plan or an agenda. It's like getting people to see deeper into each other and make those human connections.
Yes, it's really like there's a gap that we can broaden. If you're familiar with Stephen Covey and his work, his first book that was very sort of like a landmark resource, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, was really a significant resource when it came out sometime in the 80s. But his book after that, or one of his books after that, The Eighth Habit, and in that book, he talks about stimulus response, and he says there's a place that we can put in between the two. And I'll use my words. It's a moment of mindfulness. It's a moment of reflection, inner nature. Before we respond, before we speak, before we act, where we can be present with who we are and try to pull that other person in at that same time, or at least our sense of who they are, before we move into what we say or before we make specific choices. And that's the place that magically shows up, and people are like, wow, what happened there? Wow, I never knew he was that way. And I think I have actually a sense of the tipping point toward that. It's when people feel a tenderness for somebody. I mean, I live in New York, as I've said numerous times, and and the community that I grew up in New Jersey, Middletown, New Jersey, was the hardest hit community of all the communities in and around New York City on 9/11, because there was a commuter community right into the city. They lost more people, and I didn't live there at the time. My parents did, but they lost more people than anyone else. And up here in New York and up and down the Hudson Valley, there were a lot of people who were, affected by that. And everyone in this country, not just here in New York, New Jersey, if you go back and remember that, people were so tender toward one another. There was a softness that you felt. And it was certainly a horrific event, tragic. But in the aftermath, you drive around, you see, where were people? They were with groups. Where were those groups? Houses of worship, People were holding doors for one another. People were smiling in a very gentle way. And I remember feeling, wow, this is such a tender place we're in right now. It was something I was not used to experiencing. And of course, over time, much of that, fades away. And if we're successful in this global empathy movement, then we'll feel that sense of tenderness more often than not. And in schools, there are teachers right now who create classrooms or learning communities where that's what I call emotionally safe learning communities. That's what's going on there. And empathy and other pro-social skills are just woven within those kinds of communities.
Yeah, I really am aware of that feeling that you're talking about. I was so aware of that as well after 9/11. I remember just seeing, just looking at society, at the American culture. I mean, just the feeling, and just feeling that there was like this space and warmth. It almost makes me cry. I almost feel like, just remembering that, it just feels, it's like, wow, this is. And one of the questions I ask is, what would a culture of empathy look like? And this is really, I think, kind of what it does look like. It's kind of that space and openness and kind of acceptance and that sense of connection and that warmth and that tenderness and I sometimes wonder about that, because I kind of wonder, like, when I kind of become aware of that, it's like my eyes want to water and tear up, because I feel there's something I feel releasing, some sense of constriction and drive, and it's like, oh, this is too much.
Well, you said earlier about when you're alone, and it was in response to when I said being disconnected, and a lot of times you can be alone but not feel lonely. You can be connected to who you are. And what I'm getting from what you're saying, Edwin, is when you feel those moments of emotion, I once asked someone, why am I crying right now? And she said, when the soul is touched, you cry. And if our individual soul journey, our work here as a human being, is touched by another human, even someone we've never even met. I mean, how often have you, been reading the paper about some family's tragedy or some amazing story, of someone who was saved, and you cry and you're like, gosh, 10 minutes ago, I never heard of this person. And suddenly I care so much about them. I think we're all waiting for that, and there's that constriction. It's kind of like getting massaged and then it releases. And when it releases, it's the tears, but it's the human connection. And it's a really incredibly enlivening and optimistic view in my mind to think that you can be by yourself and be alone and think of somebody and feel connected to them and feel moved to do something for them. Even if it's just give them a phone call and say, how's it going? Or write a check and send it off to a charity that you really believe in, that you want to help others. And that's enlivening, and, going back to my work in schools and how we can, I know you've interviewed some folks who are doing amazing things in schools. And I think a common belief that people have, and I believe it, is that you can't create this culture of empathy in a school with a program. Like, here's the binder, here's the day-long training, good luck,
Yeah.
Which unfortunately is the model often that's taken. Because, I've seen it. I've seen people who, when the person comes into their classroom to run the program, they'll go to the back of the room and they'll grade papers. They won't be engaged. Not everyone, but certainly some people. I've seen others who resent the fact they got to do this thing, one more thing, But when it's a consciousness, when it's a way of thinking and a way of being, and I know I'm repeating myself, but I want to emphasize this.
The way of being, it's kind of like a sensed, felt experience.
Exactly. It's, what, it's reverberation. It's reverberating. There's a woman, her name is Dr. Levy, and she did research on group resonance, right? And that's really what it is. I mean, resonance with another, when it's happening, It could be a person you meet for the first time, or it can be someone you're very, very close to. But there's this dynamic that's unfolding where you really are, in sync, in simpatico. It's a beautiful place. And I can't say that you can create that intentionally, but you can create the conditions where that will exist. And in schools, one of the people, in the name of my book, you said a blueprint for caring, compassion, and community. Well, the blueprint for those things, to me, really comes from the work of a man named William Glasser. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Glasser. Dr. Glasser posited the idea, it's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He said that all people do is behave. That's all we do. We make choices, we behave, we act, we take actions. And he said that there are reasons why we do the things we do. There are causes of those behaviors. And he looked at the fact that we all have basic human needs, for survival. And there's physical needs, there's food. Like I have my water here, because I wanted to make sure that I wouldn't be dry. If I hadn't have put that glass of water there while we're talking, I would have been all of a sudden thinking, I should have had my water. I wonder if it'd be okay if I went and got water. That would be you have yours there too. But it would be, I wouldn't be present. I wouldn't be in this conversation. I'd be thinking, I got to get my water, And the same is for food and the same is for shelter. Those are physical needs, right? So we are driven to get those needs met. Well, there are also emotional needs. This is from Glasser. And there's 4 emotional needs that he articulated. The first one we've already talked a lot about. That's the need to belong, affiliation, to have a connection. It drives us. That's why people join organizations, join teams. We find like-minded individuals, to have group resonance with, that's belonging, right? The next need is power. And by power, what he meant by that was to feel like I'm good at something, like competence, like something I'm good at. That's why it's a really important intention for a teacher to help children unearth or to discover what they're passionate about, because that's something they'll pursue and they'll be good at, and it'll meet that need for power, not over others, but to feel empowered, right? When a child is not feeling power or control, that's when they try to get power over someone else, and that's bullying, right? And empathy, by the way, is the opposite of bullying another person. So it's belonging, power, freedom, which is to have a voice, to Ask one of the empathic practices for children is to give them voice. Ask them, what do you think? How do you feel? What do you need? I had an experience with my son the other day. My son Gideon, he's 8 years old, and he had a friend staying over, and it was in the morning, and I made them breakfast, and he didn't like what I made him. Okay, and he was giving me sort of a hard time about it, and I was a little upset with him, right? So I went in the other room and I said, Gideon, could you come here? I want to talk to you about something. And he didn't come, right? So I let it go. And later that day, I said, Gideon, why didn't you come? He said, Dad, you really embarrassed me in front of my friend. I said, oh, I wasn't mean to. He goes, well, I said, I was trying to get you out of the room. He goes, no, I didn't like that. And I said, okay, I'm sorry about that. And I said, do you know why I was wanting to talk with you? And we talked, and he told me why he didn't like what I made him. And it made sense. And he understood why I was feeling the way I was. The point is, I gave him voice. And we made an agreement. I said, I will never do that again when your friends are here. If something happens that I'm upset about, we'll talk about it privately after they leave, right? Now, in a school, if you're in a cafeteria as a lunch monitor, which is a hot spot and a hot job, I always say, public praise, private correction. Bring that child out privately, because when you speak to them and correct them in front of their peers, that takes away that power, that sense of competence. It doesn't give them voice. There's no freedom there, right? So we unintentionally, many well-intentioned adults in schools unintentionally disconnect kids. And it's something that has to stop, in that teachers should, we have people who aren't in schools often are critical of teachers. People involved with empathy and social and emotional learning are often critical of teachers, generally. That's not useful, it's not helpful, and it's not true. We can only do the best we can with what we know. People deserve to be trained, they deserve to have the dialogue, right? And people go, oh, you named for them. I didn't know that, right? So this is a critical thing to name. Kids need to belong, they need to have power, they need to have a sense of freedom and fun. And the fourth thing they need is they need to have a sense of fun, which is to be engaged in what we're doing, and to have healthy relationships. The point of that list, that blueprint list, belonging, power, freedom, and fun, the point of that list is to say that it's not only a blueprint for emotional safety, it's also a way to assess the cause of a behavior of a child. Children are incomplete. They're not complete. And as adults in their lives, whatever our role is, we need to nurture their development and see their behaviors as forms of communication and decode those behaviors. And those 4 words, belonging, power, freedom, and fun, that's the roadmap for decoding. And by doing that, you're practicing empathy and you're meeting their needs at the same time.
Mm-hmm. When you're talking about needs, it reminds me of nonviolent communication, which kind of organizes itself around needs as well. And they have a whole series of needs that people have, everything from security and fairness and others. And as I've kind of looked into the nature of empathy, I've kind of seen empathy as a need as well, in the sense that empathy is this, it's like how you organize all these different needs is, kind of open for sorting, I guess, in the sense that, with child development, from what I've been reading, is the importance of being seen and being heard. It's kind of like what you're saying about voice, but that is sort of, it's like being empathized with and be seen and see yourself reflected in someone else. So it seems to me that empathy kind of in itself is a human need. And with the science that we have now about, oxytocin, that as we were talking about, that sense of connection and that feeling of the tears, it's like our body, it's just being flooded with oxytocin as we connect. And as we connect more deeply, there's this chemical, process that's happening within the body of oxytocin being released, and, cortisol, the stress hormones, kind of going down. So I guess those are just a couple of things that come up for me in terms of needs, that there's just a lot of different ways of looking at those needs. I'm kind of wondering what you think about, like NVC, or nonviolent communication, sometimes called compassionate communication.
Hmm. Well, I was first introduced to NVC when someone from New Zealand had my empathy book. And she called me up and she said, "Are you familiar with NVC?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Oh my gosh, you have to look into this because what you have in your book," and my book is really, really written for the practitioner in the school to create this empathic culture and to teach these pro-social skills and to create a school that I call as a school of belonging. So it's really written for someone who's a teacher. And this woman said, "I've been trying to get the local schools here to allow me to come in and do my NVC work with children, and I haven't been able to find an entree, and I think your book is going to help me do that." So I first learned about it through that. And I know folks here where I live who are NVC trainers, and they've described some of the activities and exercises they use in their training because they're facilitators of this. Um, and I'm not that familiar with it because I've never been trained in it, but I always sensed that it was, and you can tell me if this is accurate or clarify, that it was really about having skills, but also a framework to be present with another person's multi dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so there's different areas that you can look at and say, "Oh, that's what's going on," and then help them see what is going on with them, because often we have blind spots as to why we're doing what we do. Is that somewhat
Yeah,
what?
I see it as I mean, the way for me, empathy is kind of the value that's that felt quality that you're talking about, that state of being, of felt experience. And NVC is like a process. It's like one tool. I see it as one tool out of many that kind of
Mhm.
helps you kind of get to that point. And there's just a lot of ways to get to it. I mean, the arts, I think, is huge. I mean, traditionally the arts has been one of the, and this is kind of a process that's kind of come out of psychology, the work of Carl Rogers, Marshall Rosenberg, and some others. So they all seem to me to kind of overlap, and I'm very eclectic. It's like just be aware of everything and use everything and try to weave it all together. So but
I'm the
anyway,
same.
just the needs based is something I see a parallel there. The four needs, they have a whole series of needs. The needs from the science that I'm seeing of just that we have a need, that for to just to develop as full, human beings. We have a need, to for that attachment, that whole attachment, theory and
Mhm.
process. So um, those are just a little few thoughts about that, kind of exploring that whole needs aspect.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Carl Rogers because my mentor, the late Dr. Gerald Edwards, was totally a Rogerian guy, and we used to run these 8 and 10 day residential training experiences between for 60 to 80, sometimes 100 people. And one of the key aspects of those trainings was the community meeting. And we'd sit in those meetings, and I know the work out at Carl Rogers at the center, that's still the Center for the Person, right? They will just sit in these meetings for hours, and it's being present. And it's really, I said empathy is really another way of tapping into emotion, and emotion really is energy. It's really an energetic that we're talking about here, energetics between and amongst people. Um, and as you say, the arts. I'm like you, Edwin. I am a synthesizer. I take multiple experiences and things that resonate with my experiences, my beliefs, and that I can use in my work, and I will pull them together, and they'll come through me as a way of teaching and a way of working with children, and adults too. Um, I feel like I'm continuing to repeat myself on those points, but I think it's critical to know that if we're going to work with kids, we've got to work with each other. We've got to work with ourselves. And that's the inner nature, which moves to the outer nature. And if you're into it right now, I don't know if you can hear, I have some chickens
Yeah, I
outside.
love that. I hear the roosters going. It's great. I love that as kind of background.
Well, the funny thing is, we have these chickens, and we've had this one hen who's been sitting on eggs for about, well, a little over 3 weeks, and 2 days ago she had 4 little chicks hatch, and it was under our porch. And about 20 minutes before we started talking, I went out and they were walking around, and I was holding them, and I thought, you know, if someone holds a baby chick or holds a little puppy or a baby, you know, Mary Gordon's work with Roots of Empathy, that creates an empathic response. I mean, it's pure, you know, it's like, oh, it's so precious. It's that tender thing we talked about. So I was wondering if you'd heard the roosters out there letting me know they're watching me.
Yeah, that's great.
But I wanted to bring you and anyone who will be watching this to a place out of the head and into the heart, because I think empathy really emerges from the heart. I call it a heart skill. You know, everyone has their own take on this stuff, but you know, for me, as we said earlier, you know, I've been doing this work for so long, and it was completely just a path that created itself as I was walking it. You know, I didn't have an end result in mind, and what I was doing was I was working with kids and working with music and dialogue, etc. And one night I was leaving a recording session, and someone gave me this tape, and it had a song on it. And I listened to the song, and I was totally brought back to what Daniel Goleman of emotional intelligence would call the memory of an emotional memory. And emotion is learning. When we have a strong emotional event, we'll remember it. When our needs are met by an adult, Glasser calls that the quality world. The quality world are all the joyful memories we ever have. And if we can affiliate an adult with that, or associate an adult, they'll be a quality world person, right? Well, that's positive, but there's also negative emotional memories, as we all know as well. So I'm driving home, I'm listening to this song, I pull my car over, I was brought to tears. It brought up so many emotional memories, so many memories. And I determined in that moment I was going to learn the song. I was teaching 6th grade at the time. It took me a few weeks, I learned it. One day I went into my class, I sang it. They couldn't stop talking about this boy. His name's Howard Gray. And the song is told through the eyes of the bystander, of a kid who likes this kid, but is afraid to be his friend, right? Because of that need to belong, okay? It's the universal story. And I sang that in 1986 for the first time. I'm going to do it for you in a moment.
Great.
But what I was going to say about it is that I'd been doing it for a couple of years. I used to go in and do workshops. You know, I have my guitar and I sing, and I would sing it, and it's a true story, which really gives it a lot of credibility. Like that girl said, make it real, don't make it contrived, you know. And I sang it, and I turned around on the board. I used to turn, and I would always brainstorm, like, why are people made fun of? Why are people treated this way? And typically we'd get a bunch of answers, but the number one answer would always be because they're different. That would come up. And then I'd say always, well, how does it feel? And they would give me a lot more for that, like a lot more answers for feelings. They could relate to that. And this one particular day, I turned around to do that, and I suddenly had this vision of writing the word empathy on the board. Totally unintended. Hadn't been thinking of the word. This was 1989. And I wrote the word empathy, and I put a rectangle around it, and I drew a little like wire, and I said, that's a picture hanging on the wall. And empathy means to be able to look into someone else's picture of the world. So let's practice that right now with Howard Gray. And that, Edwin, was the beginning of this work on teaching empathy. I still do that lesson sometimes, you know. So this is why when you said you're passionate, I really feel that moment when I had that vision, and it really was like a vision, that was when I knew in my heart, this is what I'm supposed to do. And so I'm not sure if I should recite. Maybe should I sing it or recite it? What do you think I should do?
Do you have your guitar there? Is that the?
I do. I'll have to go get it. It's in the other.
Sure, that's fine. I think
All
the
right.
guitar would be great to have that.
All right, I'll be right back.
Okay.
Hold
on. So let's take a look at David's website. This is it, David A. Levine. And the home page, let's see, go to the home, and there's a video there of one of his classes. I was just giving a tour of your website. You have a video there, and bully prevention workshops for students, residencies, classroom communities of caring, keynotes, workshops for educators, a bully test.
The bully test, that's the story I told earlier about President Obama. That's what I said. If we gave a bully test, we might teach this stuff in school because they would be measuring it, you know.
Oh, uh-huh.
Okay. Hold on, my dog over there. Okay.
Great.
See if my,
You're
so let me tell you, I'm back.
If you could frame it a little bit, you're way down. Yeah.
You can't see the guitar?
A little bit up. Sorry.
Is that better? What if let me see if I stood up.
And yeah, back up a little. That's good. Great. Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. I'm sorry to do this. I'll be right back. Okay.
Go for it. No problem.
I got it. Just afraid my dog was going to bark. He often barks when I sing. How's that? Is that okay?
That's great.
So this is by a man named Lee Doman, who's become a very good friend of mine. It's called Howard Gray. It's a true story. And it was the driving force in doing this work on empathy. Most everyone I knew put the whole Gray family down. They were the poorest family in that little country town. Howard always looked too big for his funny, ragged clothes. The kids all laughed at him. Jimmy Jones would thumb his nose. Howard sat across from me, 7th grade at school. Didn't like it much. Mama taught the golden rule. So when the spitballs flew at him, I never would join in. I guess that was the reason Howard thought I was his friend. And after things would quiet down, sometimes I'd turn and see the grateful eyes of Howard Gray looking back at me. Howard Gray, oh Howard Gray, somehow they got their kicks out of treating you that way. Deep down, I kinda liked you, but I was too afraid to be a friend to you, Howard Gray. One day after lunch, I went to comb my hair and saw they had Howard pinned against the locker in the hall. They were poking fun about the big hole in his shirt. They had his left arm twisted back behind him till it hurt. To this day I can't explain, I won't try to guess just how it was I wound up laughing harder than the rest. I laughed until I cried. Through my tears I still could see the tear-stained eyes of Howard Gray looking back at me. Howard Gray, oh Howard Gray, I can't believe I joined them all, treating you that way. Oh, I wanted to apologize, but I was too afraid to be a friend to you, Howard Gray. From that moment on, after I made fun of him, he never looked my way, he never smiled at me again. And not much longer after that, his family moved away. That's the last I ever saw, heard of Howard Gray. That was 20 years ago, and I still haven't found just why we kick a brother or a sister when they're down. Well, I know it may sound crazy, but now and then I dream about the eyes of Howard Gray looking back at me. Howard Gray, never quite forgiven us for treating you that way. I only hope that somehow you can hear this song someday, and you'll know that I'm sorry, Howard Gray. We'll probably never meet again. All I can do is pray. May you and God forgive us, Howard Gray.
That was fun. And it brings up a lot of memories too. It's amazing. I remember a friend of mine. He was overweight. You know, I was in high school and kind of teasing him and kind of being a little kind of relentless about the teasing until he finally kind of broke down, and started crying, and I just felt so bad. You know, so kind of that for some reason that memory kind of comes up, and I think we all have those kind of memories. And
we certainly do. I mean, that what you've with as adults.
Yeah, as adults.
Adults will often have memories come up and look back and think about choices they made. Children, they want to roll their sleeves up and talk about this. And it's really an entry point for them to explore empathy because they've all felt that. And it's one of those things, sometimes it's easier to talk about difficult and emotional issues when it's someone else's story. And that allows them to talk about it, but they're really looking in the mirror at their own experiences. And like I say, I mean, I didn't plan to hear that song that night. I didn't plan to learn it. And all of a sudden I sang it for my class. Other classes wanted to hear it. I've sung it all over the world. We actually, and Lee Doman, the writer of the song, you should check his website out. Just Lee Doman, Domann. If you checked out his site, just Google him. He tells the whole story of the writing of the song. But I will tell you this, that at one point, Lee found Howard Gray as an adult. And I made a video of the two of them getting together and talking about the experiences. And it's very, very illuminating to see the consequences of the experiences that they both had growing up. You know, and, you know, as I said, children are developing. They're not complete. But one thing that they're very savvy about is contrived lessons, or someone telling them how they should be and how they should act. They'll tune you right out.
That's going back to how we kind of started. You were saying about the girl that said, you know, let's make it real. So it's like, how do you take empathy and apply it to real conflicts within people's lives or real situations and dynamics, and looking for that reality. And I think that would be in contrast to someone coming up and says, okay, you will all now follow the golden rule, kind of is this dictate or something.
Right. Or how would you feel if they did that to you? You know, like that's kind of a shaming sort of a question, you know. And, you know, we talked about art. Certainly music is art, and so is writing. But as I said before, it's an art form to be able to facilitate conversations with people, not just children, but people that are real, that are relevant, and that they can reflect on and learn from after the event. I often think the best learning is after the fact. You know, it's like you see a movie, and maybe 2 weeks later you'll think of a scene and it'll bring you back, you know, to that. That's the best learning, because it's one thing in a controlled environment called a classroom or a workshop to have these conversations. But in the anxiety of the moment, which is a term from the late Dr. Arnold Goldstein, who was the director of the Center for Aggression and Research in Aggression, Dr. Goldstein wrote some great resources, skill streaming and aggression replacement training. He said, you can do the greatest lessons, but if you look out the window during recess in the anxiety of the moment, are they practicing those things? You know, and I think that's a lesson for schools. You know, schools, they spend they do invest money in posters and maybe an assembly or two. And one principal said to me the other day, we stick it in their face all the time. And I thought, oh, so you're going to bully kids not to bully, like that's not what it's about. It's about, as we've said, and it's kind of the thread that I'll weave it all with, is real conversations about human beings, about the human experience, and validating that we all have challenges from time to time on what's the right thing to do. We all have challenges in questioning why we feel the way we do. And if we can come together, those challenges will still exist, but they'll be softened a bit. The edges will be softened around them. So that's the art form, to create, Peter Senge, I mentioned him before, from MIT, the author of Fifth Discipline and Presence, and he's doing work all around the globe now with food and World Food Bank, etc. He talked about creating a container for people to learn in together, and you create the conditions, and the four walls of the container are those four emotional needs. That's how I see it.
Well, I feel that we can kind of go on for hours around this, and I actually would like to, because I love talking about empathy and exploring it and all that. So I don't know how your time is, but I would like to continue kind of this exploration. Perhaps maybe go through some components of parts of your books, or wanting to do some panel discussions, is bring in some others. I know you're doing that symposium coming up that you were talking about, that some of that, perhaps some of those attendees or speakers would like to be, online doing something like that, or kind of look for other ways of kind of connecting around how do we, build a culture of empathy. And like what you're just addressing is, like, how do you create the structures, right? You can have a classroom, if there's a teacher in the front, everybody's just sitting listening, that's like a structure, and versus, having a circle process structure. So these different structures kind of facilitate empathy. And so there's so many different aspects to, the nuts and bolts of building a culture of empathy that I would love to explore with you.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, you make me think of, see if you probably gathered that I make linkages all the time to things that might seem disconnected. See if this makes sense. But, there's in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I guess there was an article, I think it was in Time magazine, which stated that it was a dying city. And the town said, we don't want to, are you familiar with this? They didn't want to.
Uh-huh.
So what they did is they hired a company to produce this music video. They took the song by Don McLean, long, long time ago, I can still remember.
Mm-hmm.
What's the name of that song? I know all the words.
Yeah.
I remember the name, but anyway, everyone who's watching this knows that song. Anyway, they took that song and they had the entire town do a whole lip sync they call it a group lip sync of that song, celebrating the town, because that's what that song's about. Long, long time ago, it's sort of the music died, and they say, no, it didn't die. We can bring it back to life, right? But what they did is they brought a consciousness to that entire city that said, we have to wake up and say, no, we are a great city. This is an amazing place, and people need to come here, and we're going to celebrate that, and we're going to do something really fun and really cool, right? Well, I think of that same sort of vision, that same dynamic with this issue. We need to create a group lip sync around the idea of an empathic culture, of a culture where people are tender toward one another, where you don't need a tragic event to bring people out to connect, where you are brought out to connect when you look in someone's eyes, or you shake their hand, or you watch that child playing outside, and it connects you and it binds you together. And when we do have disagreements, we have the skills and the mechanisms to resolve those disagreements, to resolve those conflicts. And we are doing this event at the Ashokan Center. It's the first event that I'm bringing there. I'm bringing all my work there. What is there? The AshokanCenter.org. If you went to that now, the AshokanCenter.org, you'd see mostly living history and environmental science and outdoor education. Wonderful stuff. We're expanding that. And I mention that because this symposium is really the beginning, Edwin. And my hope is that, we're going, not my hope, we will put on like a 3-day event there, a 5-day event. But I want to run some of these. And I did read your email about perhaps doing that. I'm very interested in really lining something up that's, we have enough time to design it, where we can bring people from around the globe. I mean, my book, Empathy, it's amazing to me. I wrote this book because it was my life's work. I found a publisher who really liked the idea. I put the music to it, and it was done, right? I get contacts from people in, as I've said, New Zealand, South Africa, India. One guy in India created a whole school based on my book. And it's really heartening for me, but I'd love to find ways to link us all together. And this is a way of doing it. And you certainly have the passion and the technological knowledge to make that happen. I'd like to explore that with you. Certainly, I'd love to be involved in other kinds of things you're doing, like panels, but I think we should try to link up with the Ashokan Center and bring this to the world, this issue of empathy for the world. It's really, you know what it is? It's world peace is what it is.
Yeah. Well, there is, Johan Galtung has a quote that I always, mention, and it's, peace is resolving conflict with empathy, nonviolence, and creativity, and it's a never-ending process. And I would even shorten it to peace is resolving conflict with empathy and creativity, and it's never ending, because for me, empathy inherently has the nonviolence just by in its being, in its essence. But so what you're talking about, though, is some kind of an event. Like you can have panels, which can be kind of more, academic, kind of analytical, and you're looking at some kind of a public event that you kind of create the energy, the underlying energy for of empathy and connection, and kind of how to create something like that, maybe on the internet, a global, everybody does something on a single day, maybe around the world, some kind of an empathic action, or says the word empathy, or I don't know, something like that is what you're thinking. I'm getting the sense.
Yeah, like and the song is Bye Bye Miss American Pie.
Oh yeah,
right?
that's it.
Bye Bye Miss American Pie.
I remember that one. I liked that one when I was a kid too.
Yeah, drove my Chevy to the levee, but the
levee was dry. Yeah.
We got to fill that levee up, and I love that. And one of the things we're doing at Ashokan in the fall, we're beginning a whole year of what we call the Ashokan Youth Leadership Peace Summit, where we're bringing high school students together to work on leadership skills with empathy as being a core skill. And it's going to go on for the whole year, right? Well, one of our ideas is to bring adults together and do the same thing. And that's what you're talking about. And I love it. And by the way, you talk about dance. I mean, what kind of dancing do you do?
It's kind of a freestyle, kind of an improv dance, and also contact improv. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's kind of like a physical contact. You're always in contact with the person, and it's total improvised movement. So if it has to do with steps, I mean, forget it. I cannot remember a step, but improvisation works for me.
Well, the reason I ask that is because the Ashokan Center, the foundation that created this space, is really driven by two wonderful dance musicians and musicians in general, Jay Unger and Molly Mason. And Jay's a fiddle player, Molly plays guitar and sings and plays bass, and they have been creating these music and dance events at Ashokan since 1979, before it was the Ashokan Center. And what they've done is to create a sense of community through the dance and the music. And people leave there and bring it back to their communities and do it in their communities. So it's this thing called place-based education. Where you are is you learn about it. You learn about like where you are, like your own environment. Like here in the Catskills, we wouldn't learn about the environment in California because we don't live in California. We live here in New York in the Catskills. But you can then go somewhere else and take that knowledge and apply it to where you are. So if we were to bring people together using music, and certainly Jane and Molly have the ability and the vision to create a musical gathering around an empathy day like that event, I could see that down the line of being something pretty significant and pretty amazing that we should explore, we should continue to talk about in the
Yeah, the
future.
whole empathy in the arts. One thing I found that works. One thing right now I'm kind of looking at making connections, with people like yourself. So I found that people in the empathy world tend to be kind of like isolated, and some of them are so. I mean, I was talking with someone in Bulgaria, and she started crying because it's so good to kind of connect with other people who value empathy. So right now I'm kind of focusing on the connecting people within around the world who kind of value empathy. And then it's like I really want to do more around the arts, like you're talking about. One thing I found that's kind of entertaining is I would ask people, "What's your metaphor for empathy?" And one person said, "Oh, it's two hands holding each other." And then, "What's your metaphor for the opposite of empathy?" "It's a tray of ice cubes." Well, let's create a dialogue between the two. What does the hand say to the ice cube tray? And it's so entertaining to have that kind of that dialogue between, the two different sides. So that's kind of like more of the artistic, creating this
Sure.
this story and narrative and dialogue.
Yeah, I mean it's creating like a transpersonal exploration of this topic, and sometimes creative problem solving or planning is really strengthened when you do it through metaphorical thinking. Where you step out of the arena that you're focused on and you go to some other place entirely, and it evokes other kinds of emotions and visions and images, and then you bring that back in, and that's what the arts can do. I mean, that's it evokes images, feelings, vibrations. Um,
And what
and
is your
it's
metaphor of empathy? Like typically, the empathy is defined as the metaphor of standing in someone else's shoes, looking through someone else's eyes. For me, empathy is like a cornucopia, and I'm just wondering if you have a metaphor of what empathy is like.
My metaphor is more of a sensory one. To me, what hit me right away when you said that, it's kind of like being in an embrace with somebody, but there's this warmth and comfort and security in that moment with that embrace. And so it's the kinesthetic of like I'm home. And if you can feel that when you're with other people, I think then empathy is present.
Mm. Well, one person I asked that to, they said it was, I don't know if you ever read like Dante, he goes into the inferno, through the seven levels of hell.
Yes.
And he said empathy is like someone with their arm over your shoulder, like Gabriel, the angel that he went through hell with, that you have someone, with you having that. It's kind of your embrace, but going through the levels of hell. So another metaphor. So that's all good stuff for exploring through an art kind of a medium.
I think, as I've met so many, like you said, this is, and you didn't use this word, but I use it. This is such a trendy topic now. I mean, everybody is speaking of this, and so I've had many, many conversations. In fact, I wrote the book Teaching Empathy. I remember when I wrote that, or when I was writing it, I was working in schools, and I was always talking with teachers, and it was so like provocative, the title, and it got, can you teach it? Can you learn it? Is it natural? Is it the parents' responsibility? Is it innate? Why don't kids, all these things. And, you know, I'm finding there's really two schools of, or two places people stand on when they talk about it. One is very cognitive. It's very scientific. They'll get into the neurosciences and the front part of the brain. It's very interesting to see what happens with your brain when it's being empathic and when it's receiving that. And then there's the other place that people stand on, which I think probably is more of the island that I live on, which is the land of heart. Art. It's a heart skill. It's a natural place. Babies have it. You watch babies. It's really cool. You talked about attachment before, and we raised our two boys in our own version of attachment parenting, and now they're 11 and 8, and they're boys. They're regular boys, bruiser guys, etc., etc. And when they're with little kids, they're so gentle and caring and empathic. We were just talking about this morning, and my wife said, well, they're so empathic because we were empathic with them when they were babies, you know. Well, you know, it's sad to think that if they don't get it in the first 3 to 4 years of their life, that they never have it, you know. So that's the cognitive thing. The hard thing, I think you can gain it anytime, you know. We can you know, resilience. And we didn't even talk about resilience. That's a huge part of my work. Resilience, optimism, hope, to be able to spring back, you know. And someone who's resilient is whole. And the word whole comes from the word heal, which means to come back together. And we can come back together when we're embraced in a community. We can become whole, we can be healed, we can be resilient. Empathy will do that. And then you become empathic to somebody else and you do the same for them. It's the greatest gift is the gift of altruism and generosity. You know, that's the American Indian way, you know, to give truly is to receive. And that to me says we can learn it at any time. We can experience it at any time and learn it through that experience.
Like I was saying, I think we could go on. We've been going about an hour and 22 minutes. It's the longest interview I've done, or the dialogue. And I'm fine with talking for hours. I don't know how you are with time, but I kind of want, I guess one thing I would say, we're kind of getting into the definition of empathy a little bit, kind of the cognitive way of looking at it and the emotional. And I've been trying to get a sense of the definition of empathy. And kind of what I've come up with is 4 parts to it. And the first part is what I call self-empathy, sensory awareness of self, mindfulness, kind of self-knowledge. It's like that self-awareness of what's going on in your body, sensory. And then the other I call mirrored empathy, which is through mirror neurons, which I think is kind of what you're talking about. It's like really feeling. As you're shaking your head, I'm feeling, you know, that's being mirrored. I'm feeling the quality. It's a very soft quality that you have, a very gentle, you know, quality. And I can feel, I can really feel that quality coming across from you. Then there's the imaginative empathy, which is more something called perspective taking or cognitive empathy. It's more taking the position of another kind of in an imaginative sense, perhaps like actors kind of do it both. They kind of have that too. You give an actor, you say, this is the situation, what's it like from that person's point of view? And so it's a little bit along that direction. Or you can see how would the other person think and experience kind of from that point of view. And then the fourth part is empathic action, which I've seen through mediation when there's parties are in conflict with each other. And I mean, they're just like pissed off with each other. And then you get them through the mediation. And then it's how will they work together afterwards to take the next step. And they kind of create a new connection through this empathy, the mirrored empathy and the imaginative empathy. And then they work together to create kind of like a new steps going forward. And I've heard it defined as that empathy is when the blocks to action are removed, that don't exclude. So everyone's included, everything's included, and you're working together to in a collaborative sort of a way. And that would be empathic action. So just wondering how that resonates just real quickly.
Well, all 4 of those areas of focus are things that I work with and that I teach. And I put it into a very simple model, which is in the book. I call it EEA, Event, Empathy, Action, EEA. The E, the event, is the person looks at an event and sees what's happening and just it registers, like they could summarize back to you what occurred. The empathy, the second step, is to imagine what that other person is going through and what they feel and what they need. And then the A is the action. So what am I going to do about it? So it's similar to what you're saying. I often tell children that our greatest empathic skill is something we've been using our whole lives, imagination. To imagine. And, I talked earlier about that space between, stimulus response, feeling, action. That middle place that I often teach them is imagining. Imagine if I did this, what would happen? I call it dress rehearsing. I actually took this and varied it from Gary Zukav, who talked about dress rehearse your choices. And I say, dress rehearse it, give it one last chance in your mind. If I say this, if I do this, what might happen? Don't like that. Tweak it a little bit. That's why we have dress rehearsals. So, yeah, I think, what I think the essence of it is, we need to have people see empathy as something beyond just feeling what someone else is feeling, or, as you said, walking in someone else's shoes, but more significantly, taking action. We can say anything, but words are meaningless. Actions make the difference. That's where we need to bring people to.
Well, great. Then thanks so much for spending an hour and a half talking to us here. And, I do hope we can take empathic action together. I'm just so excited because just all the work that you're doing resonates, so deeply with me, and kind of just the way you approach it. So I'm really looking forward to maybe, via email, we can start looking for some ways of taking next steps, another interview or dialogue, bring some other people together, and look for those events that we can create that energy that you're talking about. I don't know if you have ideas about that already, but would love to explore that with you as well.
I'd love to. Let's continue to keep in contact. Thanks for all the work you're doing. It's really an amazing opportunity you're providing people to share their ideas and to learn from others. And I'm all about collaboration and continuing this relationship.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.